Okay, so earlier today, a contact of mine, Ivil Silic, asked me about my thoughts on Theresa May and also the situation in New Zealand. He's a New Zealander. Um, Admittedly, I haven't followed the situation in New Zealand very closely, but it is big political news there. John Key has stepped down after 8 years in office, replaced by Bill English. He's 54 and from Lumsden. So, just an open question for any possible New Zealand viewers. What do you think of the situation? Um, like I say, I admittedly haven't followed it closely. There's been so much going on in the world, but 8 years is a long time in politics. So, what do you think Mr. Kay's legacy is? Is it good or bad for New Zealand? Do let me know your thoughts. So, I was asked about Theresa May, and I'm just going to sum up some of my thoughts. This is not going to be a very comprehensive video, but I'm going to sum up some of my thoughts on the Prime Minister so far. She's been in office actually 150 days today. So still a relatively short time. It's still probably too early to be thinking about any major sort of events or anything like that. But we knew even before she ascended to the office that whoever would succeed David Cameron would have the issue of Brexit to deal with. Cameron, of course, resigned on the outcome of Brexit. Now, just a quick word about David Cameron. I think it would be unfortunate, not just for David Cameron, but for the sake of academic reality, or let's say comprehensive analysis, to simply dismiss the entire Cameron premiership through the prism of Brexit. Cameron was in power for just over 6 years, and it was a very eventful 6 years. A lot happened in that time. Um, so I think Cameron's legacy is a lot more than Brexit. Cameron won't go down as one of our great prime ministers, but I don't think he will go down as a bad prime minister either, or at least a forgettable prime minister. Um, I don't support his party. I'll just say that off the cuff. I'm not a Tory supporter, and there were aspects of Cameron's domestic policy that I was very critical of it, to put it mildly. So I'm certainly not going to forget David Cameron. I don't think he'll be quite in the same breath as Margaret Thatcher or Tony Blair, but he will be certainly more significant than, say, an Alec Douglas Home or Duke of Grafton. So I'd put Cameron somewhere around the middle at this stage. Um, Excuse me, I still got those flipping ulcers. Very painful. Anyway, the first thing that is striking about Theresa May is that she, even having been in office for 4 months now, still seems something of a distant figure to the British people. Now, part of this is because she was not elected as Prime Minister, and she has been questioned about this a few times by journalists. Um, Back when Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair, he was a well known figure because he'd been Chancellor for 10 years. Now, Theresa May was also a prominent politician insofar as she had been Home Secretary for 6 years under Cameron, which was the longest serving Home Secretary. She served, I should say, as the longest serving Home Secretary for about a century. So she was definitely one of our heavyweight Home Secretaries. But even with that, she still is something of an unknown quality. I suppose there's a comparison here with Hillary Clinton in the sense that both powerful women who are seen somewhat as distant from the public. Um, I think with Theresa May, there is that aspect, the fact that she wasn't elected, and she, I think if this isn't addressed, she runs the risk of becoming another Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown, to his credit, had, in my opinion, some strong moments. Earlier today, I watched his speech in the Scottish referendum on the United Kingdom, and for me, that was actually his golden moment. That was a very powerful speech in defence of keeping the UK together. Unfortunately, it came when he was out of office. Um, and in all reality, as kind as you want to be, the Brown premiership really wasn't that successful. I think May does run the risk of becoming another Gordon Brown if she sort of sticks by this notion of, well, the Conservatives are the party that were voted in, it doesn't matter who's Prime Minister. It is true that we don't directly elect Prime Ministers in this country. Nevertheless, I think there is definitely a controversial aspect to an unelected head of government. It does seem fundamentally undemocratic. That's not to say that it's not democratic, because the point that she made that her party was voted into power democratically is true, and it's a party that chooses their leader. But the thing is, she isn't just leader of the Conservative Party, she is Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So, of course, it matters who that is. So, I do think at some point over the next 4 years, she would be wise to call an election. I think one big mistake that Gordon Brown made was not calling the election when he was actually doing quite well in the polls. There was a period after he took over in office, sort of late 2007, early 2008, where he was actually doing quite well in the polls. Now, if Brown had called an election, say, in early 2008, I believe he possibly would have won. Would have been close, but I think he would have won. Cameron was still sort of establishing himself at that point. But Brown sort of allowed the situation to build up, which really gave Cameron ground. Now, the situation is a bit different because Jeremy Corbyn, only the most hardcore Corbynites would genuinely believe that he has a chance of winning in 2020. Um, this isn't sort of an attack on Jeremy Corbyn, it's simple reality. The chance of Jeremy Corbyn becoming next British Prime Minister is extremely limited. It just, because Corbyn's Labour just isn't reaching out as much as it should be. And the centrists know this. And they're in a wilderness because they're obliged to be loyal to the leader. They tried the rebellion and it failed. So they're in a real. I would not like to be a centrist Labour MP right now because they're between a rock and a hard place. You know, they have to be seen to be loyal to the leader because there's that pressure from the members. But they know that it's going to be difficult to sell to the wider public, people like me. I'm not currently affiliated to any party, but I would be very willing to listen to a centrist message. But I could not vote for Labour with Jeremy Corbyn as leader because I might vote for individual candidates, but not as a party of government because there's too many positions I just cannot accept. And this video is not about Jeremy Corbyn, but the point I'm making is, so long as Jeremy Corbyn is Labour leader, I think Theresa May is in quite a strong position. Nevertheless, I think it would be a mistake for her to be complacent. So let's just look at Theresa May for a second. I mentioned that she's a distant figure. The reason I say that is because her approach is very different from David Cameron. David Cameron and Tony Blair were very, very much populist in the sense of kind of being reality TV prime ministers, if I could put it that way. Both David Cameron and Tony Blair were very, very acutely aware of the power of the media. It's not that Theresa May isn't, but I think she is far less likely to do, for example, when Cameron was opposition leader, he done webcam, and he spent a whole day in a Muslim household in Birmingham, and there was all these sort of, perhaps it would be unfair to call them publicity stunts, depending on your perspective, but that's something that Theresa May just isn't going to do. So we're not going to see Theresa May doing kind of PR stunts like that. In that sense, ironically, she's quite similar to Gordon Brown. And I say ironically, because she was critical of him deciding not to call an election. Now she's sort of in a similar position. Of course, a lot happens in politics, and she does have a unique position in being the first post Brexit Prime Minister, or let me put it this way, the first post EU Prime Minister. Even though we're not completely out at the moment, it's very difficult to imagine a situation where the Remain side can really put forward a convincing argument that we should stay in when the majority have voted to leave. Because if that was the case, the majority would not accept it. What we need at this time, and I think Theresa May understands this, is reaching out to people. Um, and she needs to be a prime minister who can unite both sides. And she personally voted to stay in, although she was not very passionate about it either way. In a sense, I think that can be a strength in terms of negotiations. I believe had Boris Johnson become prime minister, it would have been the negotiations would have been very tense because you would be in a situation, the prime minister would be in a situation where they're trying to negotiate with people who basically see them as a traitor to their project. Now, in negotiating with Theresa May, they know she was a Remainer, so they think, okay, here's someone we can work with. Having said that, a few days ago there was a very awkward image emerged of May at an EU summit, and she cut a lonely figure, and it looked very awkward. So, she is in a very complex position um, of being the first Prime Minister post EU. Since Ted Heath, we've had, let me just get this right, Heath, Wilson, Callaghan, Thatcher Major, Blair, Brown, Cameron. I think that's 8 Prime Ministers during our time in the EU. So that's a long time. Um, so Theresa May is having the very complex situation of having to handle these negotiations. Of course, she knew this because she went for the leadership position when she knew that she would be the one having to deal with this. Andrea Leadsom would have had to do the same thing. I think Leadsom, again, like Boris Johnson, as a leaver, she would have found it more difficult. When I look around in British politics right now, I cannot think of anyone better for the position of number 10 at this exact moment. And from that point of view, yeah, I think she probably is the best person for the job. There will be some who say that she's boring, she's technocratic, but maybe that's what we need. Theresa May is not the sort of politician to make big, grandiose speeches. She's not a wonderful orator. Um, she is a PR prime minister. She's not a Tony Blair. She's not a David Cameron. Maybe that's what we need at this particular moment. I don't think that means that she is going to be a weak prime minister. I actually think she has the potential to be a strong prime minister. Of course, it's too early to tell. Anything could happen in 4 years. Um, and there will be big tests to come. We could face a major terrorist attack. Now, I think with her experience as Home Secretary, I see no reason why she wouldn't handle that in a strong way. Um, I think it's in all of her interest to hope that she does a good job of this because these are very complex times. And it isn't just about the EU situation, it's also about the continuing threat from the Scottish nationalists. And when it comes to preserving the United Kingdom, I do trust Theresa May. I was inspired by the speech that she made when she became Prime Minister about how important she takes the United Kingdom. I was inspired by that. Um, and that for me is extremely important. Actually, I consider the Scottish issue probably even bigger than the EU issue because it's been around longer. The UK is 300 years old. We were in the EU for 45 years. So, um, excuse me, 43 years. So, yeah, she has a lot to handle. And I think this is something that people need to go beyond partisan politics. Whether you are a Conservative or Labour or Lib Dem or Green, you should wish Theresa May does a good job. Now, there's going to be some things I'm going to strongly disagree with her on because she is, after all, a Conservative Prime Minister. I'm not a Conservative. For example, I am still very critical of their approach to welfare. I think it's an abomination how unemployed people are treated in this country. And I see no signs that she's going to change any of Cameron's policies on that. In terms of the cuts, I think May and Hammond are not going to be quite as ruthless as Cameron and Osborne, which is a good thing. But they are still Tories, and I see no reason to believe that they're going to be radically different in that regard. Um, Inevitably, there's been comparisons with Margaret Thatcher. I don't think that Theresa May is Thatcherite in any sense. I think she's a lot more centrist. I think she's also more of a, how can I put it, amicable figure. with the exception of her first Prime Minister's questions, where she sounded slightly Thatcherite. And actually, that was arguably her first big test, that whole Trident vote. In that sort of period, she did come across as a second Iron Lady. I remember that time when, I forget whether it was Jeremy Corbyn or someone else said, would you be prepared to, I think it might have been Angus Robertson actually, push the button? And she said yes. And whatever your thoughts on Trident, that was clearly May trying to be tough. And it came across that way. She came across as someone who wouldn't mess around in that sort of situation. So in that sense, I think she does have the capacity to be a strong leader. Um, in terms of foreign policy, obviously the EU is a big thing. At the moment, we're not actually engaged in major combat roles in wars. So in that sense, she's actually the first prime minister in a long time not to be involved in a major foreign war. We do have troops still in Afghanistan, but that these days is more on a training basis. That's not to say that nothing's going to happen in the next 4 years, but I can't imagine Theresa May is going to look for, some foreign adventure when she's having to go through these very complex negotiations with Brussels. Um, what more can I say? I think, what do we know about her? She's the daughter of a vicar. She was born in Eastbourne, East Sussex. She's 60 years old, which puts her around the middle as prime ministers go, slightly higher actually. Slightly older, but it's a very normal age for a prime minister. Um, what else can be said about Theresa May? Um, yeah, people say she's cold. Now, I don't know what she's like in cabinet meetings. I don't know what she's like with colleagues. Obviously, I'm not a member of the cabinet, but I don't see it. I just see her as being adult. She gets above the sort of. For the most part, there was that issue this week about all the. Apparently, she had a big spat with Nicky Morgan over her choice of trousers. This is trivial nonsense. That as a nation, we really, it's good for tabloids, but it's really not important. Um, but I do think that Theresa May, I think to colleagues, one reason she is in such a strong position is she avoids the Michael Gove school of gossip. That is to say that she avoids scheming. So she's sort of trusted by everyone and yet not really known by everyone. And that is actually a very strong position for a leader to be in. Um, we could say she's a lonely figure, but she's married, so she's not in solitude. So yeah, I'm going to leave it there. I've already spoken longer than I intended, but I think we should all hope that she does a good job. Personally, I don't support her party. I quite like Theresa May. There's areas I disagree with her on. As Home Secretary, I did take issue with some of her immigration policies. Certainly not the hard line against Islamists, and I am, by the way, reassured by the fact she's not afraid to use that term. A very good sign. But I don't agree with the hardline approach to foreign students. I think that is a big mistake. I also don't like the May approach of making life difficult for mixed couples. As Home Secretary, she had legislation whereby if if one partner was British and the other person was a foreigner, they would need to be earning a certain threshold. It shouldn't be about how much people earn. It should be about contributing to society, integrating to British values, that sort of thing. There shouldn't be a gamble on love, sincere love, based on how much people earn. I understand there is a need to get rid of bogus, sham marriages, but it shouldn't be based on money. It should be based on values. So I guess for me that was a personal issue because at the time I had a partner who was Chinese and we didn't know what our future would be. I don't want to get too much into personal details, but I think that's a big mistake. I also think being hard on foreign students is a big mistake. But on the other hand, she was the Home Secretary that got rid of um, Umar al-Bakri, who was one of our most notorious Islamists. So overall, if I was to say how content am I with Theresa May as Prime Minister right now, I'm not talking about all her policies, I'm not talking about her party, solely Theresa May, I would say 6 out of 10. I've no major reason to be uncomfortable. I think she has the potential to be a strong Prime Minister. Time will tell. So we'll leave it there. And yeah, time will tell. Apologies, this, yeah, I definitely spoke a lot longer than I intended, but there has been a lot to say. So that is Theresa May. And back to the beginning of the video, if you're a New Zealander, what do you think of Bill English? Is it good for New Zealand? Not good for New Zealand? Let me know why. And thanks for watching.